Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us as we launch the book From Environmental to Ecological Law. Want to welcome you, all of you who are joining us by Zoom, and I know some of you are also tuning in by Facebook Live. So again, thank you. What we're celebrating here is ecological law and the progress we're making in developing that idea. The work of doing that is, of course, something that will never be done. It's an ongoing process, and it's so great to be part of that. But one thing is done, and that is this book. And it was a long journey to get there. It really started somewhere around the time that ELGA, the Ecological Law and Governance Association, was established in 2016 and then launched in October 2017. And as part of that launch, there was a workshop in Montreal, which was framed around the problem that ecological law is trying to solve, problems with environmental law and contemporary law in general, and then the solutions that ecological law is offering, and finally, how do we get there? What is the transition from contemporary law to ecological law going to look like? What are some proposals for that? So out of that workshop, several of the authors of this book participated, and we added a few more, and we were very fortunate to get a very good publisher, Routledge, to be interested in this book. And so our book is being published as part of their EarthScan series. And it's just a terrific point to be in time. But this idea of ecological law, my own experience was was when I started my graduate work, and I was wondering, well, what's the law part of ecological economics? What's an eco-bounded conception of law all about? And I did some research, and I actually found there's very few references to ecological law, unless you're talking about ecology and laws of ecology, which is a different thing. The problem was I was only researching that in English, because had I done it in German, I would have discovered the work of our fearless leader and a real, the person who's rallied so many people together around the idea of ecological law and related concepts, and that's Klaus Bosselman. And we were so fortunate to have Klaus write the foreword to this book, and also to be with us today to do an introduction to this book launch. So Klaus, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Kia ora from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and thank you for your kind introduction, Jeff. It's lovely to see you all. Of course, many friends that I know and some friends that I haven't yet met. It's a great pleasure and honor to say a few words of introduction to this, what I consider to be a great testimony of the work that the Ecological Law and Governance Association has been doing over the few years. I will just show you a little bit about the beginning that Jeff also alerted to, and that is the meeting we had of the IUCN Academy of Environmental Law back in 2016, where we adopted a manifesto with the same title of the book. So just very briefly, this manifesto was in itself a result of a collaboration of many concerned environmental lawyers finally getting together and adopting this manifesto, which subsequently has been endorsed by about 400 environmental lawyers from around the world. So we are really looking at two different paradigms here. The traditional concept of environmental law, this is part of the manifesto, can be probably briefly characterized as rooted in Western and anthropocentrism, dualism, individualism, and utilitarianism, and is really ecological blind and critically competing with property and corporate rights. Environmental law sits at the periphery of the entire legal education system and, of course, the system of legal practice. And this is where we are at. We have not been saying that environmental law is guilty for all the threats around the world for the ecological crisis, but it's certainly part and parcel of the underpinning concept that environmental law has been shaped by. By contrast, so the manifesto, ecological law is based on ecocentrism, holism, and strong sustainability, and aims for ecological integrity as a fundamental principle of law or Grundnorm, and can be expressed in many ways, including specific rights of nature. I might add that we just finalized a quick other manifesto in Germany that calls for a constitutional reform based on ecological law principles. So there's good news to be shared, but I will brief you about progress in Germany later on, if you are interested. Of course, this wonderful book of yours, and not mine, sits in great company with so many other books around the theme of ecological law that have been published over the years. So this is just another highlight, but it is a highlight in many ways. But it also indicates that the book reflects on ecological law principles that are really not brand new, but rather have been part and parcel of cultures all around the world, certainly indigenous cultures. But I might also highlight the fact that in even the Western context in pre-industrial times, we of course have traditions of care and responsibilities for future generations. Even the concept of sustainability is pretty ancient since the medieval times. So there's a lot of history behind it. We could also say that environmental law was not totally ignorant of its commitments from the past, philosophical underpinnings. It has been totally dominated by the two paradigms of the Industrial Revolution and subsequent capitalism, and that is just growth and ongoing systemic exploitation of people and the planet. So ecological law is really a very alternative concept, and it comes, of course, at the right time in the middle of the pandemic, where we begin to learn, how deeply involved humanity with the natural world is, and how we cannot neatly separate wildlife from so-called civilization. So all this is somehow captured, I feel, by this book. It shows the translation, the transformation from current environmental concepts to ecological coherent frameworks. And it does so, as far as I can tell. I have not had the pleasure to read it in detail, but it does so, of course, as the structure indicates, by identifying the problem areas, and then secondly, looking for solutions, and then critically identifying practical steps, how we get to those solutions. So I really want to congratulate you on this great achievements, the editors, Kirsten, Peter, Michelle, Jeff, and Carla. But equally, my congratulations to all the authors who have spent their time. And I certainly can promise, from my perspective, is going to be a textbooks in many law courses to come, not just at my university here, but I'm confident all other universities around the world. So with that, I look forward to hearing more about contents and hearing more from several of our authors. And I certainly look forward to finally reading the book. So thank you very much for having me here. And again, congratulations. Over to you, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Klaus, for putting the book in that broader perspective. I told you that we framed this book around the problem, the solution, and the transition. But before we got to that, we started with an overview chapter. And we were very fortunate to have Professor Massimiliano Montini from the University of Siena, who's also a member of the Ecological Law and Governance Association, and someone who's done a lot of big picture thinking about this transition. So we'll turn now to an overview of this idea of moving from environmental law to ecological law. Massimiliano, please.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for introducing me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you this evening, which is for me is actually the evening in Italy. The aim of my, first of all, let me thank Jeff and all the editors of the book. It was a pleasure for me to contribute to the book and to be part of this event and for the presentation of it. I've been working a lot on this concept of the transformation of environmental law into ecological law in the last few years, and also I've been involved in the starting of ELGA, which I think it's also this day an occasion to celebrate ELGA. So we can move on. I'm trying to provide a short overview of my chapter, which is the overview chapter of the book. So we can go to the next slide. Maybe Jeff, I have to ask you to move. Yes, okay. So the starting point of my analysis on the transformation from environmental law into ecological law was really the fact that we are witnessing a global ecological crisis, which is composed of a climate change crisis, of a crisis related to biodiversity, of a tendency to have an impairment of the health and integrity of ecosystems. So we need to start from there. We need to start from the fact that we are not happy with our dominant economic model, and we're not happy with the way that environmental law is dealing with the environmental issues. So we move now to the next slide. And in brief, what I'm really convinced is that in the Anthropocene that we are living in, humanity is called, first of all, to recognize its responsibility to act. So we cannot continue witnessing the ecological crisis without changing our attitude. So we need a new attitude, a new approach in order to have a sort of human development in harmony with nature. We need to go beyond what is the current situation, and starting from some reflections on the relationship between what I've been calling the age of rights, which is what we have been witnessing so far. We need to move towards a new age where rights are paired with responsibilities. Let's move on to the next slide. And so in the old age of rights, the basic assumption was that humans have an inherent right to dominate nature. And this has justified massive exploitation of the resources, massive pollution, and the progressive destruction of the ecosystem. This is something that has not been stopped by environmental law. What we need now is a new age of rights and responsibilities, where we need to embrace a new approach based on a new holistic vision, a cosmovision, according to which humans are an inherent part of the ecosystem in which they are placed. I think this goes back to the idea of the mutually enhancing human-earth relationship, firstly advocated by Thomas Berry, which I'm sure all of you know very well. But I think this is actually very important, because here we're not talking about fixing environmental law. We're talking about completely changing the attitude towards the protection of the environment, the protection of the ecosystems. And humans should be actually see themselves as part of the ecosystem. This is one of the main changes we need to make. Let's move on. The focus of our activities as human in this new age of rights and responsibility should be take care of our common home, as Pope Francis defines it in the famous encyclical letter of 2015. This should be the priority of our activities. This means that our sustainable socioeconomic development should be in line with the planetary boundaries. And in other words, we may say that humanity should flourish within the safe operating space, which is given by the finite state of the planet. Let's move on. I try to go quickly to raise some of the points which are then better explained in the book. One of these points is the role of law. As it was said at the beginning, that for me, as Jeff said at the beginning, for me it was a bit the same feeling that he had when I started dealing with an approach towards ecological law a few years ago. I was surprised by the fact that there is not much about ecological law. There is not much about an ecological approach in law. And one of the reasons for that, in my opinion, is that a few people understood what might be the role of law in this transition, in this transformation. I think this is very important because law plays a very important role. And what is more important is that law is not neutral. I think there are still a lot of people around the world who think that law comes after the economic approach, comes after many other issues. I think law can be a driver of change. And law is not neutral to the kind of human development that a society decides to pursue. Therefore, I always recall a very important phrase from Stefan Westland, which really inspired me a lot in my research, which says that unless law is made sustainable, it will protect unsustainable conducts. So in this sense, we may create a link between sustainability as interpreted in the right way, as our friend Klaus Bosserman taught us, recognizing an ecological matrix, an ecological core into the concept of sustainability. If we understand sustainability correctly, this concept may help a lot in going towards this transformation of environmental law into ecological law, whereby the protection of the health and integrity of the ecosystem becomes not only a goal, an objective, but a prerequisite for any sound path of sustainable human development. That's really what has been driving and steering my research and some of the also of the work of EGA, I may say, in the last few years. So let's move on to give you some more thoughts. What might be required in brief to promote the transformation of environmental law into ecological law? I think we may identify at least three main changes. The first one is a change of the main objective. The main objective of ecological law, as compared to the old environmental law approach, should be the prioritization of the health and integrity of ecosystem protection. This is something that is already clear from what I've been saying so far, but this should be always at the center of the picture, because I think is not often a problem of the quality of environmental law. The problem we have is the underpinning goal, the underpinning objective in the application of environmental law, which is often the problem. So that's why I think it's really important to keep in mind that we need to have a completely different objective of protection if we want to have a real ecological law approach. Another key point for this transformation is the choice of a new reference approach. This is what has been called or can be called the blended anthropocentric ecocentric approach, which goes beyond and overcomes the traditional distinction between an anthropocentric and an ecocentric approach, or what, if I'm not mistaken, my friend Jeff Garber calls a human inclusive ecocentric approach. So an ecocentric approach where humans are part of the picture. And this goes back to what I said earlier, that humans should see themselves as an integral part of the ecosystem they're trying to protect and they ought to protect. And finally, a third big change that is needed is a new key paradigm. The new key paradigm should be related to the respect for nature and the respect of all forms of life. That's very important. That's the big change as compared to this old idea of domination of humans over nature. We need to have humans becoming trustees of nature, trustees of all forms of life. If we have this new paradigm, I think we are on the right track to promote a shift, to promote a transformation towards ecological law. I have a few more slides, but I think time is running, and maybe I better stop here to leave some time to the other speakers. Obviously, in my chapter there is much more, but I think we now have. I hope I was able to give you an overview of the main ideas underpinning my overview chapter and underpinning some of the thoughts which are contained in the book. So I would say that I can stop here, and so that I can leave more time for the other speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Massimiliano, and you did really convey some of those important overview ideas. And again, they start, as we'll turn to now, with the problem of contemporary law. And from the overview perspective, as you explained, we talk. We're concerned about fragmentation of law, that environmental law is really subservient to other things like protection of private property, as opposed to protection of the commons, the relative weight of privatization compared to the commons, the way that law supports perpetual economic growth despite the consequences, and so on. As we were laying out the book, we found that if people wanted to talk about problems, they'd really incorporate a lot of that in their chapters on solutions. So those chapters talk about the problem as well. But we had two chapters that were really fun in that they looked at some maybe more obscure aspects of the problem that we're dealing that's associated with our contemporary law systems that are maybe not the most obvious aspects of the problems, and they may not point to the most obvious places where solutions are needed. But just because they're hidden doesn't mean they're unimportant. And we have with us today one of the authors and also one of our editors, Peter Burden, who described one of these problems. So Peter, I'll turn it over to you to say a few words about your chapter.
Thank you, Jeff. And as everyone else has said as well, a lot of respect to the editors and the authors who managed to pull together an edited volume during 2020. It was a really big effort. So in this section of the book, as Jeff has said, Reed has put together a great chapter on thinking about ecological law beyond Earth and an outer space ethic, which is a really not something I'd thought a lot about, but which I think is a fascinating contribution to the book. My own chapter looks at a slightly different problem, and it's that proposals or the ideas for ecological law, which Klaus, Max, and Jeff have spoken to, and which the rest of the book engages, need to be championed by someone. And it's not uncommon, I think, for writers to rely on the power of their idea that they're presenting. It's so obvious, it's such a good idea that it's obviously going to happen at some point, or to sort of leave the last section of a book to this is how we're going to get it done. And I understand that problem because how we do it is really challenging. But I guess the contention of my chapter is that proposals or radical proposals for ecological law are only going to occur when there's people or a multitude of people willing to champion them and fight them. And one problem that we face today is that those advocating these ideas, or even sometimes just modest changes to the status quo, can be characterized or described as terrorists or as dangerous people, and which brings different kinds of surveillance onto them. So in my chapter, I look in particular at a comparison between Australia, which is where I am, and Canada, but I'm sure you've seen this in various jurisdictions around the world, where people are described as terrorists and therefore are surveilled by federal police, intelligence services, and sometimes also in combination with the private sector security forces. There's a great line by Jeffrey Monahan. He calls this relationship between police, intelligence services, and the private sector the state-corporate symbiosis, which a lot of activists find themselves intertwined in. So in terms of a problem for realizing ecological law is that people who are pursuing the goals we want to see realized get demonized in that way. People are too afraid to be involved because they don't want to be caught up in this sort of surveillance. So it has a very strong deterrent effect. And so as well as looking at that problem and sort of examining how it plays out in a couple jurisdictions, I also argue that we need to find strategies for helping the public identify with us as activists and as citizens engaged in these sorts of struggles. And one way to do that is to focus on the commons or public things, what our friend and colleague Prue Taylor would call the common heritage of humankind in our struggles and in our activism. And perhaps through those forms, people can more readily identify with the struggle that we're engaged in. But as Jeff has said, there's many other problems detailed in the book, and you are all very well familiar with them, so I won't bore you with those details, but just to point to a couple others where there's people looking at problems in terms of economics and the growth model, problems in leadership, which includes the influence of the fossil fuel sector on governance and the revolving door between politicians and the private sector. Not so much emerging, but the enlarging problem of ecofascism is something people talk about, and the crisis of imagination. So people thinking that there's no alternative to the status quo, or perhaps even worse, that it's too late to do something about it anyway. So they're the various problems that are engaged, and thankfully, the rest of the book is geared towards solutions and then how we go about realizing it. So I'm sure that's more what you would like to hear about. So I'll turn it back over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Peter. And thanks as well for your role, not only as an author, but an editor, and sharing that part of the burden. Yeah, so we're turning now to the section of the book about solutions. And we start that section with a chapter that places ecological law in the context of this new era or epoch, I guess, that is being called the Anthropocene. It's a loaded word. There's been books and articles written about it, but it has a common understanding of this age in which humans are having a geological global impact that's threatening the capacity of the planet to support human and other life. And Olivia Woolley wrote a chapter called Ecological Law and the Anthropocene to kick off this session, and I turn it now over to Olivia.
Thank you, Jeff. I've been so pleased to be able to contribute to your book, and it's delightful to see you after having corresponded so much over the course of the last year, and also Peter, who I've exchanged several emails with. I agree with you, Peter, that it's frustrating to come up with all of these good ideas, which people then seem to brush off so easily. But I'm hoping that now some of them appear in this brilliant book that people will sit up and take notice. And it's also good to see many colleagues who I haven't seen since we gathered together in Siena. I do hope another opportunity for interaction comes up soon. To talk about my chapter, as Jeff said, the title is Ecological Law in the Anthropocene. There is quite a literature on how this, the advent of this era, the Anthropocene, affects law that seeks to protect ecosystems, what type of legal response that demands, and this chapter adds to that literature. For those of you who are not familiar with the terminology, the Anthropocene denotes that that the reach of human influence has gone beyond affecting individual ecosystems to affecting the condition of the planet at large, with the consequence that all ecosystems are affected because they all interact with planetary conditions. And in order to answer this question, I think the first question we need to consider is, what difference does the Anthropocene actually make to the way that we use law to try and prevent our activities from having negative ecological impacts? And the conclusions I set out in this chapter are that the Anthropocene's advent doesn't actually change a lot. What it serves to do is to underline problems that were already there, so to reinforce them and to exacerbate them in two respects. We rely on laws largely to try and prevent ecological harm by predicting the effects that activities will have on ecosystems, and also trying to keep the cumulative effects of activities within ecological limits. To be blunt, I just don't think that those approaches work because of the complexity and dynamism of ecosystems that makes prediction difficult, if not impossible, and a poor understanding of where limits lie in ecosystems and when they're vulnerable to change. The Anthropocene worsens that by adding the complexity of planetary conditions into the mix. Second, I argue that one thing that hasn't changed is that we continue to ignore a body of evidence that is available to us and has always been available to us at our peril. And that is what I call warning signs, information that we already have that ecosystems are vulnerable to failure, to which in the Anthropocene we can couple information which tells us that conditions on the planet now are changing in ways that in previous epochs of the Earth's development have also been significantly ecologically harmful. So there is this body of evidence out there that we should be using in our law to trigger responses aimed at protecting the ecological support base for human living. I go on from that to identify the third thing that hasn't changed, which is that we continue to ignore obvious ways of using law to address the ecological consequences of our actions, which is to actually start focusing on reducing the cumulative pressures that those actions pose on ecosystem functionality, thereby reducing ecosystem vulnerability and on restoring ecosystems. We need to have a more policy level focus on how ecological pressures can be reduced, with law playing a more constitutional role rather than it being used to allow us to continue to pursue our economic and social objectives, but keeping everything within boundaries which we don't actually know where they lie. Okay.
Thanks very much, Olivia. So, paying attention to warning signs in new ways is a big part of a set of solutions here. But towards the end, and it couldn't have been a better segue, you mentioned the role of restoration. And the next chapter in the book talks about how principles of ecological restoration and the idea of restoration more broadly resonates with ecological law. And that chapter, called Restoring Land, Restoring Law, Theorizing Ecological Law with Ecological Restoration, is written by Emile Boulot. So Emile, tell us about your chapter.
Sure. So as Jeff mentioned, yes, my chapter theorizes with ecological restoration to explore the potentials for ecological law. And this is also the topic of my PhD, and is therefore a topic very close to my heart, and also, I guess, to my supervisor's deadlines as well. And so ecological restoration, for those who don't know, is a process of assisting the recovery of a damaged ecosystem with the aim to restore the ecological structure, the complexity of the system, as well as the integrity of the system, so that the system becomes self-supporting and resilient, and it also displays a level of historical continuity as well. And due to the concern over biodiversity collapse, climate change, and water security, we've seen the UN General Assembly take up the call, I guess, for ecological restoration and declare 2021 to 2030 a decade of ecosystem restoration. So it's a pretty current hot topic. And to summarize my chapter really quickly, I first consider the ways in which the governance of ecological restoration challenges the current liberal environmental law system, which we have, which conceives, I guess, of the human existing out of nature as one of its central tenets. And then second, I consider the ways in which ecological restoration governance, or the governance of it, can contribute to the development of an ecological law that is restorative, resilient, adaptive, and situates law within the complex ecological systems in which we live. And so that's my summary. I'll pass back to Jeff.
Thanks, Emile. As someone sitting here in the bitter cold of Montreal, that Tasmanian sun looks quite restorative to me. Thanks for sharing that through Zoom. And so I'll just quickly mention a few things about my own chapter, which comes next in the book, called Our Rights of Nature, Radical Enough for Ecological Law. And what this chapter does is, first of all, recognize that rights of nature are maybe one of the ideas that resonates with ecological law that actually has some traction. We've seen rivers around the world and constitutions in various places recognize rights of nature. And my own view is that this is a very positive step, and yet there are some dangers, and that rights frameworks can maybe be seen as having some intractable connections with anthropocentric worldviews that always puts human interests at the fore, and ecological law is often cast as a more ecocentric approach to law. So there's some tension there that this chapter explores as to whether rights of nature really go far enough, even if they may be a very positive transitional step towards where we want to go ultimately with ecological law. And one of the things that I look at in that chapter is lessons we can learn from indigenous legal traditions. Now, certainly it would be a mistake to equate indigenous legal traditions and indigenous law, which is so diverse and varied around the world, with ecological law across the board. But certainly there are lessons to learn. And the next chapter really goes a little more deeply into that, called Ecological Jurisprudence and Indigenous Relational Ontologies Beyond the Ecological Indian. And that is written by Kirsten Anker, who I would ask to speak a little about her chapter now.
Yes, hi everyone, it's good to see you. I'm also in Montreal, where I am the uninvited guest on Haudenosaunee territory, and that's just one of the things to which I am indebted to them for. So Jeff just told you the title of my chapter, and I guess the starting point for me was to notice that very many people working in this field would notice some of the resonances between principles of ecological law and indigenous legal traditions. Klaus Bossermann made a reference to this in his introduction, and so these are elements like the interconnectedness and value of all beings, the fact that we live in a biotic community rather than a collection of things. So these resonate in indigenous understandings of kinship extending beyond humans to non-humans, to non-human personhood, and the animacy of the earth. ecological primacy, that is making sure that human systems are grounded in ecosystem integrity. We find resonances with the idea from many different Indigenous peoples that the law comes from the land in some sense, or of some sense of harmony or buen vivir, a good living that involves the mutual flourishing of all elements of life. So of course these similarities aren't an accident, and many of the key figures in the history of this movement have been deeply influenced by Indigenous philosophies and practices. And in places like Canada too, this turn to indigeneity is part of a kind of overall decolonial movement in the academy by taking Indigenous knowledges seriously. But I wanted to, I guess I was kind of worrying about what I sensed as the kind of tendency to romanticize some of these elements. And I admit that I'm also concerned about that in myself. I felt a tendency to romanticize in my own work. So the idea of the ecological Indian being more of a kind of idealization of Indigenous practices rather than some kind of universal truth. So the first problem is just with the generic problem of stereotypes, that they are bad knowledge practices. They tend to generalize, they're taken out of context. They can also be prejudicial, they can be disempowering because they occlude the self-representation of people of themselves and give them no voice. There's also, in this context, a colonial trope in an older version of this romantic figure, perhaps in the noble savage, that of course taps into European nostalgia for older times where, the evils of modernization had not yet begun to afflict us. So what I did in the chapter is look at, there's a whole lot of literature debunking this myth of the ecological Indian. So I just had a look at that to see what I could learn from it. And the kinds of examples this literature raises to debunk this myth are things like the fact that there were pre-Columbian extinctions in North and South America brought about by overhunting, or the uncontrolled use of fire farming and practices like that. Other people suggest that conservation, if it existed, was epiphenomenal, that is not a sort of inherent part of the practice, but just because the numbers of people were low, or perhaps the technology was not sufficient to make a big impact on the environment. There were examples of apparent waste. So people who came across in the 19th and early 20th centuries, large numbers of caribou carcasses, for instance, where it seemed to be, just killing because it was possible rather than for any kind of inherent conservation purposes. Others talk about a kind of contradiction in the worldview in which, let's say, animals are persons who make a decision to give themselves to the hunter. In that case, if the animal presents itself, it would be offensive not to kill it, even if you don't need it, because it's a gift that's being given. So there's, or there might be a belief in reincarnation, so that the key to ensuring sustainability is actually a ceremonial practice that has nothing to do with any kind of physical, act of killing or maintaining a particular population number. So there was a sense in which the scientists were calling out these beliefs as being, unscientific. Any idea of restraint, says this literature, and sort of conventional conservation practices was part of European influence. So I had a look at that literature, and then I had a look at some of the critical literature about that. And it's a good lesson on stereotypes and mythologies in general. So a lot of this interpretation of these practices is disputed. The waste can be misconstrued. Perhaps the animals were being stored in a frozen river, for instance. Perhaps there was just a change in weather that meant that this particular hunt could not be recuperated. There's an oversimplified, at least in a particular period of Western conservation practice, that simply restraining the kill is sort of the key feature of conservation, whereas if you take the non-linear dynamics of the overall ecosystem into account, sometimes it can actually make sense to do a cull. And so there was kind of a simplistic reading, I guess, of Indigenous environmental management practices. There was also a tendency to ignore informal regulation mechanisms like gossip or modelling rather than explicit forms of law. So the lessons that I take from this literature, debunking the myth of the ecological Indian, and then the critical literature beyond that is, first of all, that the life worlds from which these ideas are coming, so both the kind of the knowledge and the set of relations from which that knowledge emerges are complex. And, you know, we always have to be careful what preconceptions we bring to reading, and that those preconceptions can operate at a very deep level. The second point is that traditional ecological knowledge is place-based, and it's emerging from those lived relationships. So it's not something that can just be kind of taken out as a nugget of knowledge and placed somewhere else. Those relationships are an integral part of the knowledge, and the relationships are part of an Indigenous legal order. So Indigenous peoples themselves and their politics and their laws are part of knowledge and must be engaged with by any of us, you know, interested in using Indigenous ways as a kind of model for future practices for ecological law. So that's the kind of decolonial point, I guess, is to take Indigenous legal systems seriously, and the agency that Indigenous peoples themselves need to maintain with respect to their knowledges. And the final point, I guess, is about the limits to our epistemology and a bit of humility that needs to be cultivated with respect to what we can and can't know. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirsten. Such important messages, especially that your last note about humility and taking care when taking care and yet taking seriously these important ideas that you've laid out in your chapters. Such a welcome addition to the book, and thank you as well for your role in editing. A really great contribution. So our next chapter digs even deeper in a different way into some of these ideas that can come from Indigenous cultural or legal traditions, and also a reflection on how we should approach ideas of rights of nature. This is a chapter called Conjuring Sentient Beings and Relations in the Law, Rights of Nature, and a Comparative Praxis of Legal Cosmologies in Latin America, from somebody who grew up in Latin America and has a very intimate knowledge. And that is Yvonne Vargas from Roncancio. Yvonne, please tell us about your chapter.
Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me, see me? So I'm super happy to be here and to join Jeff and others in launching this book. I'm honored to be part of this. So I build upon of what we can call an emergent tradition of rights of nature studies in Latin America to probe the limits and possibilities of the rights of nature movement in Latin America in the context of what we can call, you know, legal cosmologies of indigenous peoples, particularly in Amazonia, where I work, have been working for the last few years. So in Colombia in particular, so ranging from rivers, we know, to entire ecosystems, the increasing recognition of legal personhood for natural beings has been, in terms of legal scholar David Voigt, a legal revolution. The Colombian legal system is a case in point. Between 2016 and 2020, our courts have recognized the rights of 10 different rivers. One more, the Colombian Amazon itself as a whole, 2 Afro-Colombian collective territories, the collective territory of the Perara Euya indigenous nation, 3 national parks, and numerous others animals, including bees and other pollinators. What is all this telling us, I ask in this chapter? What are the limits and possibilities of affording legal personhood to natural entities amid exponentially increasing new extractivist economies in this region? So I just want to give you a little bit of context of that kind of to make a point about the potential limits of the rights of nature as it is posed conceptually and practically. So since 2070, in southwestern region of Colombia, the territory of Cofán and indigenous communities and many others, I work with these two communities, have been affected by indiscriminate deforestation, the presence of guerrilla groups, drug traffickers, and paramilitaries. In 1991, poppy crops began to be planted in this region up until they reached more than 2,500 hectares. The indiscriminate logging and soil sterilization caused by these plantations was further aggravated by the implementation of the Plan Colombia, a bilateral agreement between the governments of Colombia and the United States that began in 1999 to defeat the guerrillas and drug traffickers in the country. While the country's internal armed conflict intensified, glyphosate spraying of illicit poppy crops left deeply negative traces on the indigenous and peasant inhabitants of this area. So until 2002, more or less, the Cofán and the indigenous and the Inga people have suffered a great deal, while seeing how the majority of school children and youth were all involved in illicit crops, and no effort has been made to confront and overcome the situation. As paradoxically enough, environmental and social leaders are increasingly targeted, and also the environmental movement has been very buoyant and important. So I really want to interrogate this legal revolution in the context of all this, and I try to do that in this chapter in a more theoretical fashion. So I ask, what are some of the barriers to realize this ecocentric orientation of the rights of nature in our context? So I claim that as impressive and meaningful as this legal revolution is, I would argue that recognizing nature as a subject of rights might fall short if the law is understood as a matter of language only, or symbolic language, and nature as an adequate conception of ecological and cosmological interdependencies. And this is just on the level of concepts. There are many other challenges. The thesis of law as language only, for me, seems to reinforce a much contested rift between nature and culture and other boundary-making concepts at the root of modern legal thought and practice. So I basically ask in this chapter, how can indigenous legal traditions contribute to this ecocentric project? And second question is, how could reckoning with other than human beings as agents of legal meaning and not only mere recipients of the state-sanctioned rights transform what we might mean by this concept of the rights of nature and actually law more broadly? So I'm just going to give a really brief outline of the chapter. So kind of a connected question is then, how could conjuring other than human beings as agents of legal meaning rather than this recipient of rights can actually challenge and push forward this idea? So this chapter probes this question in three steps. First, it discusses what I call a relational, building on the work of many others, a relational ontology of law that is based on the principle of radical interdependence. And I'm building here from the work of Aaron Mills, an Anishinaabe legal scholar, and also Colombian anthropologist Eduardo Con, and Arturo Escobar, and also Eduardo Con. Then I explore how this approach might challenge understandings of the rights of nature that are premised on an ontology of separation or fragmentation of the living. And also as a way to encounter these radical interdependencies in law, the third part of the chapter discusses a methodology to harness, or proposes a methodology to harness the rights of nature potentials to heal the socio-ecological relations that are concealed by a theory of law as language only. And then the chapter concludes by repairing or proposing how to repair these relations through the law, how that involves actually a crucial speculative conceptual step of rethinking our ontological commitments to an all-to-human law to hold space open for other legal imagination and practice. And for this, I think it's crucial to really engage with legal cosmologies, to engage with communities and with the non-human peoples that make up their world. So I'm really honored and happy to be sharing these ideas with you. I'm looking forward to your comments and thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvonne, and reminding us of the many different places that go outside of, say, the Western legal box for looking for solutions within ecological law. So our next chapter really takes on some of the rampant consumerism and the things that we are conditioned in our dominant social settings to want, and looks at needs-based constraints in an ecological law transition. And this is a chapter by Carla Spert. So Carla, please tell us about your chapter.
Thank you so much. I don't know how to go on the screen, but I hope I've turned on my screen, so I hope people can see me. First, I want to say it was such a privilege to work on this book with my co-editors, and an incredible treat to work on closely with a number of authors on their specific chapters. And it's also wonderful to see so many friends out there listening to this, and thank you so much for being here. Anyway, so as Jeff said, yes, my chapter is entitled Needs-Based Constraints in an Ecological Law Transition. But part of the problem it relates to is the fact that environmental law and current law more broadly support and promote overconsumption and accumulation that is pushing ecological limits. And the solution that I propose, which is just one among many solutions that ecological law proposes, of course, is to develop ecological laws that constrain production and consumption based on basic human needs. So in the first section of the chapter, I discuss whether a needs-based approach is consistent with ecological law theory. So it's a little bit of a theoretical introduction. Then in the second section, I jump to look at the literature about needs, and very briefly look at the different possible meanings of needs and how they might be defined under ecological law. In the third section, I go through, I jump again to a different place. I look at actual laws and try to see how existing laws refer to needs. And I find some laws that already constrain behavior based on needs. Not many, but it's not unprecedented. And then finally, in the last section of my chapter, I suggest some ways needs-based constraints could be articulated by ecological law. Specifically, I think in rich countries. But for example, by restricting new mines based on whether the metals would be used to satisfy basic needs or just wants, or whether the needs could be satisfied with metals that are already out there in existing stocks, or like using law to force the question, do we really need this new mine, these new metals? Another example would be banning activities that promote consumerism. And there we can think of much advertising, but also things like planned obsolescence in the production of so many of the goods we think we need. So needs-based constraints might sound like a radical proposition, but perhaps all the recent attention to what is essential may make them easier for people to support. And in any case, I think it's an area of development of ecological law that is worth digging deeper into. And I hope this chapter just opens that door. So thank you everyone for your interest in our book, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Carla, for taking on that, that a set of ideas that are so central in many ways to the economic ideas that are associated with that we have to go after these things that aren't needed in order to promote growth, and all the things that we're told society gains from that, and yet are so associated with the erosion of our ecological foundations. A very welcome contribution, and thank you as well for all the hard work you did editing various chapters and serving as one of the book's editors. So another idea that's associated with ecological law, something that Klaus Bosselmann is a global leader in, but that's also been explored by the next author, Stephanie Roy, is the idea of trusteeship theory, and her Stephanie's chapter is called "The Potential of the Trusteeship Theory for Canadian Public Law and Environmental Governance." So Stephanie, please tell us about your chapter.
Thank you, Jeff. I hope you can hear me well. I was really happy I could participate in this workshop and book on ecological law, because those ideas I've been dealing with a lot during my PhD project and this chapter, which are both interested in the question of how can we make public law and governance more eco-centric and ensure that our governments not only pursue economic growth, but would rather pursue ecosystems health. And so those are ideas we have heard in introduction by Klaus and Massimiliano, the idea of, the need for a paradigm shift for to make sure that human responsibility towards nature is promoted in our legal system. And I agree with Bosselman that trusteeship is a good idea to ensure that governments have greater responsibility towards nature. And so I've been looking at this idea in a more national, I guess, perspective, because I was wondering in my thesis, how would it look like if we were to implement that in Canada, and what would actual fiduciary duties look like? But in the chapter, I argue that I believe the trusteeship approach would be good in Canada because it's based on ideas that already exist in public law, and therefore I think it could allow for a rapid paradigm shift if we were to implement this idea. And so common concepts that are found in the idea of the trusteeship theory and in Canadian public law are those of public interest, accountability, and these kind of ideas. And the reason why it would be interesting to impose fiduciary duties on government is that it would impose a duty to inform the public, which already exists, but it would also impose a greater duty to account, which means that right now our governments are accountable to us mainly when we talk about budgets and expenses, but they don't account about how they protect nature and how they protect ecosystems. And I think if we were to impose such duties, then they would have to account on how actual ecosystems are protected and have more or clearer goals on, for example, hectares of forest that would have to be protected, and these kind of ideas. Also, it would make the governments accountable not only to current citizens, but also future generation. And I think imposing this idea of a long-term management of nature is essential, and it's not applied right now. Yeah, so I think that's the main idea of the chapter, that it would be coherent with the legal system we have in Canada, and it also implementing this idea allows for, as I said, greater responsibility, and it builds on the public trust doctrines that applies in the US right now, but also on the critiques of the public trust doctrine, because it has flaws. Because if it didn't, then nature in the United States would be better protected right now. But the public trust doctrine, unfortunately, relies too much on property and doesn't include enough of the ecosystems to be effective, and it doesn't impose positive obligations on governments to protect nature. It's mostly a way for citizens to sue government and ask them to protect nature when they don't, or to prevent them from selling land, which is not enough. So that's why in my chapter I explore an idea of trusteeship that is that impose greater responsibility than it does under the public trust doctrine, and it's based also on Klaus Wasselmann's work. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to discuss about the trusteeship and this kind of idea in the discussion after.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thanks for the reminder that some of these solutions are maybe closer at hand than others, and there's a continuum and an assessment that we all need to be making about what things seem to be ready to push for now and what things might take more time. Well, the last chapter in this section of the book on solutions is on what we can take from African eco-philosophy on forests by Ngozi Finette-Nwigwe, who is not able to be with us today. So let's turn now to the sections on transition, those very hard questions about, well, how do we get there? How do we achieve these sometimes radical and transformative ideas? So the first chapter there by Michael McGonigal is about greening legal theory. Michael's not able to be with us. The next chapter is on lawyers and ecological law, and Kinvin Roth, who also wasn't able to join us, gave me something to read. So let me just read what Kinvin would like to share. I begin by thanking and congratulating Jeff, the other editors, and my fellow authors for the success of their efforts celebrated today that began in what now seems another era at the workshop held at the McGill Faculty of Law in October 2017. In my chapter, Lawyers and Ecological Law, I sought to address the impact of the move to ecological law on the various tasks that practicing and academic lawyers perform in their current professional lives. Thus, I considered ways in which lawyers could assist in getting there in specific current examples involving the marine environment, from practice, law, and policymaking, and legal scholarship and teaching in areas of U.S. and international law. Going forward, I hope to expand on and develop this approach in the realm of international trade law with a paper in a virtual workshop entitled After NAFTA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement and Sustainability, that Hoy Kong, now at University of British Columbia and former colleague of many of you at McGill, are planning for this spring. So thanks to Kinvin for that message, and for a chapter that may look familiar for people who are looking, who are practicing law or engaged in law, and things in Kinvin's chapter maybe sort of closer in the realm of feasibility or practicality. It's a very practical chapter, so I commend him for that. The next chapter on learning, sacrifice, and legal education in the Anthropocene is by Nicole Graham. So looking at the potentials within legal education and some transformation that's needed there. Nicole is not with us either today. The next chapter, Tribal Ecological Knowledge and the Transition to Ecological Law, is by Hillary Hoffman, who's joining us with some touchy internet. So let me just thank Hillary for this contribution, which looks at how traditional ecological knowledge provides some answers and is in play in some areas of Western, some areas of law in the Western United States, and also you can maybe see pathways to the future from her connection of those situations in the West and tribal ecological knowledge. We close the book with a chapter called Practical Pathways to Ecological Law, Green Prints and a Bioregional Regenerative Governance Approach for Australia. And we do have the author of that chapter with us, Michelle Maloney. So Michelle, please tell us about your chapter.
Thank you, Jeff. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Yeah. And good morning from Brisbane. For some of you, I am speaking to you from tomorrow. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional lands of the Turrbal peoples. I live here in Brisbane, in North Brisbane, and always acknowledge the lands, always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Again, I know everyone has already done this, but a huge thank you to everyone for the effort to create this excellent book. It was a real privilege to be one of the editors and also a contributor. I'll be quick because I think I'm the last speaker, and I'm grateful to all of you for still being on our call. In my chapter, I'm focusing on a particularly, I guess, innovative, but also practical project. So we look at a pilot project that my organisation, the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, AILA, is working on with communities in Queensland, which is a state inside Australia. It's a multidisciplinary initiative, and it's basically trying to rethink environmental law and governance in Australia from the ground up. It's both ambitious, but also strangely practical. And the detail of what we're doing with some of the community groups who are piloting this thinking and activity experiment are very excited about ways to change the way that they can be, as community groups, the leaders of caring for country and caring for land in their region. The work that we're doing aims, among other things, to actually build a movement of people working to understand and create ecological law in Australia. And I'll refer back to Peter Burden's comments, this idea that somebody has to make these changes. We often point to government, but unfortunately in Australia, government, to put it lightly, are not leading the way in innovative thinking about caring for country, let's put it that way. So one of the reasons AILA is working on this project is to explore, number one, a critique of the flaws in the current system we have for caring for land, caring for nature, caring for each other, and not just leaving it there, but actually analysing ways forward. And it's deeply embedded within the theoretical framework of ecological law and earth jurisprudence. And all I'm going to do is give you a quick couple of dot points about what are some of the key problems inside the Australian legal system that we're looking at, and some of the key issues that we're actually addressing both in practice and in our writing to examine what can be done differently. If you critique the Australian legal system briefly in less than 30 seconds against the key features of ecological law, it is absolutely human-centred. The legal system that came to Australia in 1788 is the essence of the British Empire, focused on private property, capitalism, ownership, extraction. It absolutely ignores ecological limits. It does not encourage the production of the human use of raw materials or consumption and production. It does not, in Australia, include any aspect of First Nations laws. And the colonial mindset in mainstream Australian culture continues, meaning even non-Indigenous people are not yet indigenising their ways of caring for country in the land, although it's happening more and more in the last 2 decades. And very importantly, Australia's legal system does not use the principle of subsidiarity, which might ensure that local communities or even local governments have some sort of critical decision-making role. So the work that we're doing, and the project got nicknamed Green Prints because it's like a blueprint, but it's thinking about how we live within our limits. Green Prints does not start with law. It starts with our relationship with land and country at the local level. That could be at catchment or bioregional level. And by looking at what Nicole Graham writes beautifully about how the English and Western legal system de-physicalises property law, we're re-physicalising our relationship with land and the relationship with law. So this includes an analysis of local land use historically. It looks at economic activities, economic culture and beliefs. It looks at Indigenous efforts to reclaim caring for country. We look at a range of scenarios, and what's exciting for us is that the role of law comes in at the end. The role of law comes in at the end, where local communities can identify what kind of legal structures they would like to use to embed an appropriate caring for country, living within our limits, donut economics, planetary boundaries, et cetera, approach to actually looking after country. This type of approach is nothing short of radical in Australia. We don't have any illusions that the ideas that we're putting together will change things immediately, but it's part of a movement of community groups around Australia who are connecting because they're just so deeply frustrated with their inability as local people to stop unwanted extractivist and other developments. So I won't say much more than that. The chapter outlines both our approach, the flaws in the system, and what we're hoping to achieve. And it is linked to probably a good 10 years worth of practical work on the ground. So if anyone's interested, please do get in touch. It's an ongoing project. And it's just at a practical level, fantastic for groups like those that we work with who are not lawyers to be able to embrace and understand what ecological law means. We always outline in our workshops the essence of what it is compared to the current environmental law system. So that's actually, I think, kind of a handy thing, because not everybody who writes about ecological law is on the ground talking to communities and road testing some of these concepts. So thank you so much for letting me share my chapter, and over to you, Jeff.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and you know, again, for your chapter and for your editing, such valuable contributions to the book, and for really showing at the end of the book how some of these ideas are in fact being ground tested. As I mentioned, we also see this with rights of nature and other aspects of ecological law. So it's a long journey ahead, but hopefully this book gives a sense of the problems we're trying to address, some of the solutions, and some of the ways that we can get to those solutions. Certainly, it's a tip of the iceberg, but already many of us who participated in this book are reaching out in other ways, as some of the authors and editors have described, to expand on this work even further. So I'd like to, we have some time now for some comments or questions from the audience. I'd like to ask you, just so I can keep track of this more easily, to use the raise hand function using the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. If you do that, I'm happy to call on you. While I'm waiting for people to do that, and hopefully some of you will come, I'm sure you have some thoughts to share. Let me just point out as well that this book launch was the first in our annual series of ELGA webinars, the Ecological Law and Governance Association at elgaworld.org. It's once again organizing a monthly series of webinars. We have a full slate lined up for 2021. They will typically be at this time slot on the third Tuesday of every month, or at least thereabout. And you know, we will continue to explore in further depth some of the things you heard about today and some additional ideas that are being developed in the field of ecological law and governance. So, not seeing any hands raised. Yes, I see a hand. Did I see a hand? If you raise your hand and I'm not seeing you, here we go. I think I see clapping hands. We like that. So, Bronwyn Morgan, you can unmute yourself.
Hi. I was trying to raise my hands and I couldn't find it, so I clapped to get the attention. Thank you very much. I didn't know where
to look either. Thanks for raising your hand. Please continue.
No, thank you. It's very exciting to see this. It's just a very general question. I just wondered how widely spread beyond the sort of audience, the natural audience for this book, that you think the idea of, I mean, you referred to it as a field of ecological law and governance is catching on. Like, I mean, I've been sort of reading in and around this for a while, and it made complete sense to me, but I felt like it was the first time this book, one of the great things is that it's really capturing that in the title. And it's, you know, there's been a few individual titles with ecology communicating this message that it's more than environmental and going in a different direction. But just to make a really strong statement in the way that this book is doing, do you think that this has got the attention beyond environmental field, or that needs to be part of the work done by the wider efforts you're referring to?
Well, let me just start answering, and then I'll open this up to others. It's always a challenge to build a movement that's trying to affect the kind of changes we're trying to do here. So, and this happens to be an academic publisher who doesn't make it that accessible. So in other projects, I think we're going to be looking at ways to reach people at the community level. For example, I'm working now on a project with some other people on what we're calling ecological law case studies, where we're looking at actual situations. They could be projects, they could be negotiation of a treaty is one thing that's going on, where we sort of are deconstructing what's happening and saying, well, if you did this under a regime of ecological law, this is what it would look like. And we're looking for much more informal ways to get the words out about those results. through short bulletins, informational articles. So we welcome ideas on how to do that. Certainly an important component, though, is this more scholarly academic sketching out of some of the big ideas, but it's certainly not the only part of it. And I think, I guess I would turn again to Michelle's example. Michelle Maloney is doing some really good work bringing these ideas down to earth, so to speak. So we have ideas for that, and some of it's underway, and more is planned. So I don't know if Kirsten or Olivia, you had hands raised, if you wanted to talk about that, or any of the other authors.
So I just wanted to say quickly that as a teacher, I've seen, I guess, in the last 10 years, an incredible increase in an appetite for this kind of work. The students know, particularly like I'm teaching first years in a pandemic, they can see that this is we're currently in a paradigm that is crashing into its last days, and they're hungry for a different way of thinking about a way forward. So we have an audience in the students, at least.
That's great.
Kirsten. Olivia, did you want to say something?
Jeff, yes. Just an observation following on from a point you just made. I think an interesting focus for moving forwards, and one that exists and nearly all of the world's states committed to, is the Paris Climate Change Agreement. In my work recently, I've been very much focusing on adaptation under the Paris Agreement as a central route for progress towards ecological sustainability. I think if you explore the logic of how the agreement is configured and the relationship between its different goals, then the conclusion that's the need for it to work as an instrument that enables transition towards ecological sustainability is inescapable. And just a question for you, Jeff. As you have led on this book and read contributions and have years of experience working in the field, I wonder if you could share with us your thoughts on what are the absolute key, most effective ways in which law can be employed now to move forwards on making progress with better protecting ecosystems.
Well, I think climate change is certainly an arena that is essential. It's highly visible, even though there is a lot of invisible resistance to it. But it's a platform that's not going away. I think it's going to be increasingly at the front of the world's attention. To the on one hand, I can be discouraged about Paris. On the other hand, there's this 5-year review that offers a continuing opportunity to make improvements. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I think is rights of nature, where as I've looked deeply at some things like the Whanganui River in New Zealand, there's a new dialogue going on between indigenous legal traditions, place-based governance, that has the potential to create some kind of new hybrid between these dominant Western legal traditions and neoliberal orders, in a sort of a new kind of hybrid that doesn't necessarily end up with those systems being dominant. So there's a decolonial project there. I have some hope there, even though, of course, I have some skepticism too. But those would be two areas I would mention. I wanted to, so I noticed that two people, Colin Robertson and
Jeff, Melissa Gorry would like to ask.
Gorry, yes. Colin, you had your hand up before. I want to give you the chance, and then turn to Melissa.
First of all, just want to add my word of congratulations, because this book does fill a niche. For me, it's like having a vacant space that comes in and occupies that space very, very nicely, while at the same time revealing lots of other spaces, which we've been hearing about. And that's one thing which fascinates me. In terms of moving things forward, the role of community, and I see this as one of the key areas where Michelle Maloney has working on it. And also it provides perhaps some degree of protection for local environmental workers. We know they're exposed, we know they're being killed. We've got to find some ways of protecting them. And it's only if the surrounding community can actually intervene to protect them that I can see a way forward. But that means that the local community have got to see their interests are being benefited. So for me, you have to link the ecology to the rest of the life of the community to show that their life is actually being made better by it all. And then you try and get the virtual spiral working. So many ideas. I've got lots of ideas. Everyone is doing our own thing in our own area. I've got lots of ideas for little writing projects. We're working with local schools in Luxembourg and other things. We're feeding these ideas in, and also in the UN context. So we're all trying to support and do what we can to help you. And congratulations again for really excellent work by all of you.
Thank you, Colin, and good luck with your efforts. It's good to know that you're doing your part out there too. Yeah. Melissa, let me turn to you.
Thanks, Jeff. And your last comment there really fit in nicely to my question. And it feeds in a bit with what Michelle and Kristen were both saying about Indigenous legal orders and connection to land and place and working with local communities. And so I guess my question is partially, and you answered it a bit there, Jeff, saying about the example there about recognizing basically legal pluralism and other orders of governance. But I'm curious if folks on the webinar have comments on the ways that ecological law can work to be decolonized and help create more space for expressions of Indigenous sovereignty, working with local communities in recognizing the connection to the land, and that we can't just cherry pick Indigenous legal principles or understandings and incorporate them into the work that we're doing. It's something that myself, I work as a lawyer with eco-justice here in Alberta, and it's something that we're practically grappling with as we are breaking out our law reform work. And so I just would be really interested to hear from you as to the thoughts as to some of the steps moving forward, recognizing the importance of that, any work that you know of that you're doing to help really break through and help be allies to create and support that space for expression and revitalization of Indigenous legal orders and traditions.
So, well, I'm working on one project with the tribe in the Western Canada, and trying to see how something like the Wanganui River model could be replicated for that tribe. But I wonder if Kirsten Anker or someone else among the authors would like to respond, because Kirsten has done a lot of deep thinking about questions like that.
I can also jump in, Michelle here. I just had to turn video off. I had some connection problem. Great questions, and I'm currently working with a rather remarkable woman, an Indigenous elder called Mary Graham, and we're working on a book called Future Law, which explores what the future in Australia could possibly look like if we actually engage with decolonisation and ensure that First Nations people's laws, are able to be respected by the mainstream. Those laws are still in place. They've just been disrespected and treated like the people themselves terribly by the colonial government. So it's certainly something that I work on both in some of our thinking and writing, but on a practical day-to-day task as well, through community groups and the work that we do, always ensuring that they engage with the local people first and start thinking about local responses with, for those who don't know, in Australia, this continent, when it was moved in on by the British, had at least 600 different, what we would recognise as nation states. So in Australia, we're not one monolithic system. The local responses are very, very important, because it's only at the local level that people in their own communities can talk and work together at an appropriate level. So I guess I'm saying we're working on this. It's in our minds every day, probably every moment of every day. So yeah, if there's ever an opportunity to connect, please do get in touch. So thanks.
I guess I would just say that for our context in Canada, we don't have to start from scratch to think about a framework for bringing Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples together. especially in Alberta, we have treaties, and these were coming out of Indigenous legal orders in which they weren't contracts so much as an extension of kinship networks to the newcomers. And it's a little hard to specify a kind of, I guess, uniform, apart from that generic structure of relationship, any specific principles, because it will have to start with actual connections with people in place. So, I don't know where you're at, Melissa, in your own work, but it's long and slow work to build relationships with people, but that's where it has to start, and then everything comes out of that. So there's not really a cut and paste approach. It's the law is in the relationships. Thanks, Michelle.
And I guess one thing about the Whanganui River situation that may be replicated in other places is that there were longstanding claims that were unresolved, and there was a desire on both the colonial government in New Zealand in that case and the indigenous people, the Whanganui iwi, to resolve those in a mutually beneficial way. And the Whanganui iwi were extremely patient, I think, in waiting until something came about that they could truly feel comfortable with. And the hopeful way that I look at that is that this launches a new model for all people, both settler and indigenous people, to relate to very important features of place, in which the relations have a varied history for the people. But again, it's this idea of a new hybrid that breaks away some of the worst of the dominant system we have today. That's my hope for those kinds of situations, and we'll see what happens. We're pretty much out of time here. So I want to again thank everybody who joined us and my co-editors and co-authors of this book for their efforts on the book, for being here to help tell folks what it's about, for joining people into the discussion. Thank you so much. This is being recorded, and we'll make this available if people want to share this with people who were not unable to attend. Thank you very, very much.